Hello, Dr. Price. I'd first like to ask how you prefer to be referred to.
Just Bob is fine.
Oh,
Bob, all right. We like
okay.
Bob.
Well, I have an introduction I'd like to read for you, if that's all right.
Sure.
All right. Bob began as a Christian with a keen interest in apologetics, but eventually decided that traditional Christianity simply did not have either the historical credentials or the intellectual cogency its defenders claimed for it. Embarking on a wide program of reading religious thinkers and theologians from other traditions, as well as the sociology, anthropology, and psychology of religion, he soon considered himself a theological liberal in the camp of Paul Tillich. Is it Tillich or Tillich?
Tillich.
Tillich. He received the PhD degree in systematic theology from Drew University in 1981, and a second PhD in New Testament in 1993. A brief flirtation with Unitarian Universalism disenchanted him even more with this liberal extreme of institutional religion, and now he attends the Episcopal Church where he sings, enjoys the stained glass, and keeps his mouth shut.
Yeah, I haven't been to church in a while, though, but I still have great sympathy for it.
I was going to ask you about the idols you're worshiping on the shelf behind you, but I'm going to let that go for now. He's the author of over a dozen books and his own New Testament translation, the Pre-Nicene New Testament. His scripture and theology titles include Inerrant, the Wind, and The Amazing Colossal Apostle, and his historical Jesus studies include The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man and Jesus is Dead. Two apologetic rebuttals are The Reason-Driven Life and The Case Against the Case for Christ. Now he is the host of the Bible Geek and the Human Bible podcasts. So welcome, Bob. Nice to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob, for coming on the show. I do appreciate it very much so, and it's great to have you on the show. And before we start the show, I would like to let everybody know that if you don't know who Robert M. Price here is, or Bob, you can check him out on his website at Robert Price or robertmprice.mindvendor.com. That's robertmprice.mind, M-I-N-D, vendor, VENDOR.com. I appreciate you coming on the show, and I got a couple questions here, and Matthew, and of course Ned will have a couple questions for you. So let's get to this. This should be fun. So first question I got for you is, and I just watched it. Really, I have really never watched a documentary before, The God Who Wasn't There, and I watched it because I was like, wow, he was in that. I was like, I've never seen that. So I watched it the other night on Netflix. I was like, that's pretty cool. This guy's gonna be on the show. But anyway, the first question I have for you is Evolving Out of Eden. This is your latest book that was released, I think, on March 15th, 2013 this year. What was the motivation in making a book like this?
Well, it grew out of discussions I had with a man who was a Bible Geek listener, and through these discussions became a real good friend of mine, Ed Suominen, who had grown up in a very radically conservative Lutheran splinter sect called the Conservative Lestadians. And he as I say, was into science and was an engineer, and he began to study evolution. Somehow his engineering got into this, and he was always told to believe this was the most awful heresy. It couldn't be true. But once he began to explore it, he just couldn't deny the endless multitude of evidence for it, and this created a huge conflict of interest, of cognitive dissonance. And so we talked for many hours about this, and I was trying to indicate to him different options for that some people have found for reconciling their faith with evolution. Not that I believed them, but that they were worth his exploration. And eventually he wound up just painfully getting out of his church. But the material we had both been through, Ed came up with the idea of doing a book together that would examine the biblical, theological, and scientific issues about evolution and Christian responses to it, such as we had never seen anyone do. There are no doubt books simply on the scientific basis of it that are more comprehensive, though Ed handled that, and I couldn't believe the grasp he had of all these issues. But from a critical standpoint of Bible, those books that dealt with that just did not realize, in my opinion, what the issues were and didn't go far enough. And so we wrote this thing, Evolving Out of Eden, Christian Responses to Evolution. And I still think it's unparalleled in its approach. And there wouldn't be any such book without Ed. And the collaboration was so good. I even read parts of it now and say, did I write that or did Ed? He's really a clever and astute writer.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it is definitely a great book. So, my next question is real quick: is why do you think fundamentalist attempts at evolution denial has become such a pretty big problem? I should say, basically, it seems in recent years. When we go back to Kitzmiller versus Dover case, why do you think they deny evolution so, I should say, aggressively to a certain point when the overwhelming evidence is just astounding when it comes to evolution? Is there an agenda they have, and what do you think on that?
Well, I believe they think that you need conventional theism to undergird traditional values in the society. And I'm all in favor of traditional values with a good bit of flexibility on things like gay rights. But I do not think in any way a theological basis is necessary or even helpful. But I'm sure that's what they think is at stake. As William Jennings Bryan says in Inherit the Wind. He says, if man believes he came from an animal, he will remain an animal, and all this stuff. Where in fact, if you interview murderers and rapists and so on in prison, they're all religious believers. It never really stopped anybody, apparently. But I think they're afraid of that, opening the floodgates to animal savagery as if they're not already open. And then, of course, some of them have explored it long enough to see that if you really accept the implications of evolution, it just ultimately renders any kind of biblical faith nonsensical.
Wow, unbelievable. Yeah, I got one more question before we go to Matthew's questions. And this is one I actually just thought off the top of my head because I read a couple of his books, and I just want to see what your viewpoint on it. It's more of a personal question I have, and then Matthew and Ned, of course, go into other questions about the book and the topics we want to discuss. Are you friends with Bart Ehrman, and do you like the works that he does?
I'm trying to become more. I'm on polite, friendly terms with him, though his book on Did Jesus Exist, I thought was really a hack job, and said so in a review essay or two I have in a book called Bart Ehrman and the Quest of the Historical Jesus of Nazareth from American Atheist Press. Frank Zindler and I edited that, and I was pretty severe in my responses, but I always stick up for him on the Bible Geek and elsewhere because though in my opinion his critical approach to the New Testament is much too conservative, he certainly is a gifted and intelligent biblical critic. I just think that I find his approach a little bit too conditioned by the mainstream academic consensus, and I don't think he boldly goes where no one has gone before, but and a lot of his work is very helpful popularizations of what mainstream scholarship knows, pretty much like the Jesus Seminar, and I think that's a really helpful thing. Some of my books are popularizations too, but then he has done some really good original work, like his book Forgery and I think Counter Forgery in Early Christianity. That's a real landmark. And the first book of his I ever read, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, is just really ingenious and brilliant. So I'm pleased to praise him whenever I can, and I guess that's just a gentleman's disagreement on other matters.
And you should be able to do that. That's great to hear. I definitely agree. I'm going to hand it over to Matthew. Matthew?
Hello, Bob. First, I'd like to thank you not only for the work you do in theology, but also the work you do for H.P. Lovecraft.
Aha!
Oh, yeah.
Good.
My first question is it's a very broad question, and please take it however you will. But not just with Evolving Out of Eden, but your work in general. What is the overall theme that you would like someone who reads your work or is familiar with your work to take away from it?
that there are a lot more open questions than anybody on either side of these issues seems to realize, and that consensus means nothing. One has to pursue the evidence and the possible ways of interpreting it as far as you can, no matter whether you like the possible outcome or not. I don't mean to destroy anybody's faith. I'm not a crusading atheist. I don't care what anybody else believes. It's none of my business. But there are certain arguments advanced by scholars and so-called scholars that, especially something like creationism, that would be the most drastic example. But the William Lane Craig approach to the resurrection of Jesus, purported scholarship that is clear to me that it's just really spin and apologetics in the worst sense. And there I feel obliged professionally to step in the ring and say, wait a minute, the evidence does not back this up, whether it's conservative or liberal stuff. I just feel like I want to blow the whistle. But ultimately, of course, my goal is just to be Socratic. And in fact, one of the idols behind me here, though you can't see his head, is Socrates. The others are, that's Ganesha up there, Shiva's son. And behind me, there's Anubis, Osiris, Isis, and Tutankhamun. But Socrates is really my model. I want to just make new perspectives and new information available to those who are interested in the same issues, and encourage them to take account of this material as they develop their own scholarly synthesis. I don't care if anybody agrees with me about the Christ myth theory. I don't care if anybody agrees with me on my interpretation of the Pauline letters. No, I'm just trying to enrich the discussion and give people food for thought.
Thank you. That's a really fantastic answer. And that's, I think, the way that we try to approach the discussion as well. It doesn't really matter so much what people believe. It's whether or not they care about what's true when they start telling other people that their beliefs are true.
I agree, yep.
And I'd just like to add that not only have you modeled your approach after Socrates, you appear to have modeled your beard after him as well.
Yeah, luckily I don't have a smashed nose like he does on those statues.
Yeah. My next question is, what do you think of the massive disparity between those who aspire to a literal interpretation of the Bible and more moderate Christians?
Well, I think there's a terrible irony in the fact that those who are the most zealous for the Bible and think they take it literally are the worst enemies of understanding the Bible, because as Clark Pinnock, an evangelical theologian, late great Clark Pinnock, said, fundamentalists don't like the Bible they've got. So they kind of persuade themselves that it says different things to get it out of a jam, and they read a lot into it. And the whole notion of the inerrancy of the Bible, that it can have no errors or contradictions, is just a set of blinders, really a blindfold. There is so much going on in the Bible that to recognize it depends upon recognizing contradictions and errors, because these things are clues as to how to get deeper into it, to see how the biblical narratives grew as kind of like patchwork quilts or geological strata. You can understand a lot about where it came from and what the writers are saying if you drop this notion that the Bible is an infallible book inspired by God. That it's as if you were told to read it as if it were a phone book or a cookbook. It's just not that kind of a book, and if you insist it is, you will never get it.
Thank you. That really, it leads well into my last question for you before I hand it over to Ned. How do you explain the concept of Jesus mythicism, and what is your stance on it?
Well, basically, the story of Jesus, many mythicists say that the epistles of Paul and others seem to reflect a simpler belief in a Jesus who is simply a celestial God who may have come down to earth but may have given his life in a celestial manner like Purusha did in the Rig Veda. And they think the Gospels represent a later stage where Jesus has been brought down to earth. And they're sort of right, but I think it's equally important that if you just start with the Gospels, really position doesn't change much. Virtually everything in the Gospels conforms to the mythic hero archetype, the divine annunciation of the birth, the miraculous conception, the Wunderkind theme where he outsmarts all the adults when he's still a kid, his baptism story and temptation by the devil. All of these things are common in many traditions, and who knows if any of which are borrowed from which. It almost doesn't matter. He does miracles. He casts out demons. He gains the backing of the crowd, but eventually they turn against him. He's proclaimed king, literally or metaphorically, but finally is put to death on the top of a hill, and it's not clear what happened to his body. He may appear alive again after death or from heaven. There's an ascension and various things that just occur again and again. Apollonius of Tyana, Empedocles, Enoch, Elijah, Hercules, and so forth. And I think when I look at this, what are the chances that this one version of these common stories, this collection of these materials, is literally true and the historically true and the others are not? I'm a big comic book superhero fan, and to me this would be like saying, well, everybody knows the Martian Manhunter and Captain Marvel didn't exist. These are mere fictions. But Superman, well, of course he existed. What conceivable basis could there be for such a judgment? And it seems to me it's the same thing here. So if there was a Jesus, any kind of neutral, secular information about him is long gone. I mean, there might have been, but I think the burden of proof is on whoever says there was, and I don't think they're meeting that burden.
I would just like to ask you one more quick question. When did you start to worship Satan?
Yeah, I have occasionally thought in discussion with fundamentalist friends and relatives, when I hear what they're saying, I think, maybe atheism is not enough. Maybe I should go the whole way to Satanism. And boy, what a headline grabber that would be if I came out as the only Satanist New Testament.
Think of how much money you would make.
But I don't buy it.
Really, right? Yeah.
But
thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll kick it over to Ned.
Real quick, Bob, are you okay after Ned goes? If we have time, we should have time. Are you okay for one or two callers to call in?
Oh, questions? Of course.
Okay, cool. What I want to promote real now, I already got one person lined up, but real quick before Ned goes, guys, we need one or two callers soon, probably in the next 5 minutes. If you guys want to call here, it's 347-237-5360. We're looking for 2 callers, so you can call us within about 2 or 3 minutes, and yeah, we'll hold you on call and we'll get you in. So, Ned, sorry, go ahead.
Bob, thanks. Like everybody else has said, it's definitely an honor. I've looked at your work for a long time, and I'll get to it in a little while, but we've actually got something in common. The other thing I was going to say is I think my son's going to have to come over and sit on your knee. He was giving me a kiss goodnight, and when he was walking off, he asked me if I was talking to Santa Claus. So.
Oh, yeah, I get that.
Recently changed. Your show is scheduled to start.
So.
Even last night at a pizza joint, this little kid was walking by the window, and I could tell he thought I was Santa, and I waved to him, and so on. It's great fun.
Yeah, I definitely get a kick out of it. It's really great.
That's funny.
I'll get into my call. I'll get into my question so we can get onto the callers. That reading your book, it's very educational, and I love how you throw in the funny bits. It's entertaining as well. It's just not a dry read at all. But the thing that I think you and Ed did, you constructed one of the best layman's guides to evolution that I've ever run across.
Ed is amazing. Yeah,
it definitely is. I'd recommend the book just for that. If there was nothing else to it, y'all would be good. But the question is, I mean, how do you see these fundamentalists handling the fact that people are now able, like through books like yours and the internet and everything else, to truly start to understand, how and why evolution works? I mean, what do you think they're going to do with this kind of pushback, I guess?
Well, I know there are a lot of well, I don't know how many, but I occasionally see announcements of apologetics conferences. In fact, I was invited to debate in one some months ago. And I think that is one thing that's happening. They realize, especially because of the internet, that people are hearing the other side, and they can't stop them from hearing it, so they have to do their best to counter it. But I don't really think that works very much. I think a lot of people are ditching the whole thing. A lot of young people, as even some evangelical writers and pastors have plainly admitted and said, we got to really do something about this. Josh McDowell, a couple of years ago at some conference, said because of the internet, so much more atheist polemic is available that we really have our work cut out for us. I don't know what he thought could be done. But it's an interesting thing when you see people like Peter Enns and, I forget his first name, but somebody or other, Lamoureux, two avowed evangelical Christians who have written books trying to sell evolution to fellow born-again Christians, saying, look, I was once a creationist, but once I got into it, I realized I was just kidding myself. There is no way evolution didn't happen. And that does mean that Adam and Eve and all this stuff in the Old Testament is not historically true. And, of course, these people are getting in big trouble with their institutions. And they don't seem to realize the Pandora's box they've opened, that the same sort of scholarship reveals the New Testament to be just as likely mythological, but they draw the line there. And like even Francis Collins does, oh yeah, you don't have to worry about demythologizing the New Testament because that's all based on eyewitness testimony. And of course, they just don't know what they're talking about. But you can see if somebody is willing to make a sacrifice, like saying there was never any Adam and Eve, there was never any real original sin, they're already halfway out the door. And it's probably not going to be long till they and a great many others are out too. But I think that most fundamentalists will never bother to take the time to look at the evidence. They just have a vested interest in it being wrong. And I think of what Lovecraft said at the beginning of The Call of Cthulhu. He says that the most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the mind to correlate its contents. He says, hitherto, the revelations of science have harmed us but little, and yet soon it will make so clear our place, in our negligible place in the universal scheme of things, that that mankind will either go mad from the revelation or retreat into the safety of a new dark age. Well, he knew about the Scopes trial and all that. That is what is happening in creationism. They just cannot stand the implications of science, and so they retreat into a mental fortress of pseudoscience and superstition.
Yeah. And I think we also see that with the presuppositional, like the size, and that's absolutely it. If you can't deal with it, you just absolutely shut the argument down and don't even just kind of stick your fingers in your ears and don't address it in any way.
Yeah.
And kind of getting into, I actually attended Oral Roberts University for a couple of years, and that was interesting. And interesting just is being very, very generous there. And I noticed that you were saying that you kind of ran into some of the same struggles I did, and actually that's where I lost my faith, if I ever had any, in that the questions that I would ask, I would get let's say some interesting replies, and I was just wondering, especially considering you did go on to seminary and everything else, how were you how did they react to your questions when you were asking that type of thing?
Well, I took almost nothing but New Testament courses at Gordon Conwell. I wasn't in the Master of Divinity program, and the New Testament faculty were really superb. They were conservative, and what James Barr used to call maximal conservatives, in that they were very much aware of the whole range of critical scholarship and were informed by it, but it worked out a kind of a mental accommodation. They would always take things finally in a certain direction and prefer the reading of the evidence that made it more compatible with traditional faith. And that's what a maximal conservative is, though they were not completely unaware of that. It was a very fascinating time and a bunch of people, and honest enough that when I raised questions like this, they tried to deal with them tactfully and head on. And what they said was not nonsense. I remember I was in a seminar on biblical New Testament hermeneutics and how to bridge the vast gap between the ancient world, the ancient culture, and ours, to make the Bible speak authoritatively to new issues and so forth. And especially because these guys were so sophisticated, and the material we read was, it just struck me as hopelessly futile to have to jump through these hoops and go through all these mental gymnastics to try to squeeze blood out of a stone, and to wander in the marsh of ambiguity and so forth, and to try to distill something that you could confidently preach on as the Word of God. It just seemed to me preposterous. If it were really the revelation of God to the human race, you'd never be lost in these clouds of ambiguity and equivocation. And that was, they answered as best they could. There wasn't any of this sit down and shut up, or good Christians don't ask questions. But of course, none of these guys stayed in that institution. They all went elsewhere, and I have ideas as to why that might be.
Oh, wow, I really wish I would have gone there instead, because I did get the shut down and set up, and shut down, sit down and shut up, and basically, that's the work of the devil. You're being misled, and it was just infuriating because I never could get a straight answer. And I think that really fed into more curiosity than quelling anything that I had. But to get on to my last question, so we can get some callers. The other part of your book that I really enjoyed was the part, and it's actually a fairly big part of the book, where you were talking about how in the ancients, their view of nature and how creative they were in, basically just the observational inferences that they would make, and how it makes sense when you don't know the science, but knowing what they knew then compared to what we know now and still relying on the Bible, it was, let's say, telling. So, I mean, I really, if you could expand on that a little bit for the viewers, that was one of my favorite parts.
Everybody we know of, from the Vikings to the Egyptians, held pretty much the same cosmology, and it's no surprise, because it was the inevitable inference from sense data. They didn't have observational technology around. The Earth is obviously flat. It's not actually flat, but it's obviously flat. Sure seems that way. You look in any direction, it's flat. Eventually, of course, it recedes and you can't see very far, but it would be natural to say, well, that's just too distant. You would certainly think there's a dome over the sky. Everywhere you look, all around you, you can see the sky coming down to the horizon. You would certainly conclude there was an ocean of water outside that dome or firmament, because the water is coming down from somewhere. It must come through some windows in heaven. It would have been obvious that there's an ocean under the earth, but simply because of the oceans that you see, that we're floating on this much deeper abyss. And the stars, isn't it obvious that the stars are tiny little ceiling lamps? It's not true, but it's obvious, and they were in no position to know better. It's obvious obvious that the sun orbits the Earth, even though it doesn't. But how could they know? These people were very imaginative when there was no scientific. I mean, there were ancient scientists, but even they didn't know this. There's no telescopes and so on. But even before natural science, you had people that used their imagination to explain what the rainbow was and why spiders spin webs with stories. That's all they had. But if they were just stupid, they wouldn't have cared. So the ancients were quite intelligent. They just couldn't have known better, minus some inventions. So if you ask yourself, if I could call up those guys in a seance or something, the priestly writer of the first chapter of Genesis, and say, well, we now know this and that, and here's how we know it. Do you still want people to believe the world was made in 6 days? Obviously, they'd say, to hell with that. I'm glad you found out what you have. Please tell that to the world, because that's what they were trying to do. And so it is so ironic that we insist that an outmoded view of the world, the best they had in their day, but that it is wrong that should be accepted as a revelation. It is so ironic and pathetic.
That's a really great point, and I hadn't thought of that before, just how intelligent the people who came up with these things would have been for their time. If it's all right with you, I'd like to read the summary of your book, Evolving Out of Eden, and everyone should absolutely go get that book. The Kindle version is only $9.99 on Amazon. So without, if you don't have any further comments, I'd like to go ahead and do that.
Sure.
All right. The reality of evolution and human origins is now beyond any scientific dispute. We are first cousins to the chimpanzees, descendants not of any biblical Adam, but of lumbering, hairy ancestors who were making fires and hand axes in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. This challenges many foundational doctrines of Christianity. Concerned believers are walking a troubled middle path between genetics and Genesis and genetics, threatened with the loss of a cherished faith on the one hand or their intellectual integrity on the other. To escort the faithful through the hostile territory outside Eden's comforting fairyland, a whole cottage industry of science-savvy theologians has emerged. But do they manage to get anywhere? That's really well written. Did you write that yourself?
Yeah, I think Ed wrote that. I believe that was mainly Ed.
Very well put. Thank you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. All right, guys.
Yeah, he's great. What a
and Bob, again, I just want to tell you, thanks so
much. And our book offers no help.
Sorry, Bob. Go ahead.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're going to say something or no?
No, I just couldn't hear.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, negation.
No, I was just saying, Bob, thanks again for everything you do. Your books are amazing, and like Joe was saying about the documentary, I really enjoyed your part in there as well.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming out tonight. This has been great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. We got, I think, 1 or 2 phone calls here, so we're going to get into our live call segment, if that's okay with you, Bob.
Sure.
Bob, I love it. I love the name Bob. I don't know why. Bob. Hey, Bob. Awesome. It seriously is awesome. We're going to go with Ozzy real quick here, so let's bring Ozzy into the phone call. Ozzy, bringing you in. Ozzy, you there?
Yes, I'm there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, what's going on, man?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for letting me call in.
Absolutely, man. We got for our guest here, Bob.
Bob, Dr. Price. Just before I ask my question, I just have to say how much I've enjoyed reading your books and articles and hearing your podcasts over the years, especially the Human Bible. I find that one just fantastic, and I recommend it to anyone. And I also owe you the Human Bible. And I also owe you a quick thanks for introducing me to H.P. Lovecraft.
Great.
So my question for you is that secular historians are routinely charged by evangelicals, especially, with harboring a bias against the supernatural when they do their history in Jesus studies and things like that, or even having a tacit commitment to the impossibility of the supernatural. And you've always countered this by arguing that, on the contrary, the operative working assumption of historians is the principle of analogy, and I was hoping you could explain what that is and how it serves to counter the allegation of an anti-supernatural bias.
Yeah, history does not presuppose that there is no God or there is no supernatural. What they're saying with this naturalistic bias charge is, you guys don't believe that everything the Bible says is true, and that's bias, because it's not a question of that. If one admits that theoretically miracles are possible, and I sure don't know that they're not possible. If you say, yeah, miracles may be possible, does that mean that legends are impossible? If there's a God and he could do anything, does that mean he's done everything anybody says he did? The analogy thing is occasioned by the fact that, not having a time machine, we don't know what happened in the ancient past. It's hard enough to figure out what's going on now. So the historian can only ever make tentative, provisional judgments, what probably happened or didn't based on the best state of the evidence. And how do you do that? By analogy. You look at an extraordinary claim, and I always like to use this ridiculous analogy for this. Suppose you come in after a hard day's work and you plop down in front of the TV and turn it on, and the first thing you see is a giant reptile smashing buildings in Japan. What is your first thought? Oh, I guess I'm watching CNN. No, you realize I'm watching the Sci-Fi Channel. And why is that? Well, because you have never seen any kind of reportage of giant monsters destroying cities, but you've seen plenty of those in fictional movies. So immediately, you don't know, maybe somebody thawed one out while you were at work and he really is destroying Tokyo. You don't know, but you automatically and correctly say, oh yeah, this is in all probability one of those Toho Studios monster flicks. And it's the same way. When we look at claims made in ancient narratives, if there's a story of a guy walking on water or blood raining from the sky or any of these things, we think to ourselves, now, are there other verified accounts in recent memory from reliable witnesses of anything like this happening? Well, if there are, we might not even be able to explain it, but we could say, well, yeah, this may be another one. But like instances of ESP and so on, if we hear something like that from the past, well, we don't know how to explain it, but people do make these claims today. I guess this is like that. But do we, on the other hand, have legends and myths that no one would deny is a legend and a myth of people walking on water? They're Buddhist versions of this, Pythagorean versions and all that nobody thinks are historical. And so what are you going to decide? You weren't there. You don't know. But if the story you're evaluating looks an awful lot like ancient legends and, on the other hand, like nothing anyone sees today, what are you going to conclude? Probably this is a legend, too. It doesn't have a thing to do with what you think can and cannot happen. It's just a question of what seems to happen and what seems not to, what seems to be factual reportage. And so it has nothing to do with philosophical presuppositions.
I'd just like to say that there's no way you could have known this, but I am a Godzillion, and I'm highly offended by your comments.
Oh, Ozzy, you got any other questions or statements?
Oh yeah, I've got oodles of questions.
All right, let's go with one or two more, and then I got another caller lined up. So go ahead, you got some time.
Sure.
Thanks.
Bob, what do you see as the biggest or the most important conceptual obstacle to people within your academic field taking the mythicist hypothesis seriously?
Hey,
here we go. We're back. You're good.
Okay.
All right, did you hear that question or no?
The one about the principle of analogy?
Was that it, Ozzy?
No.
Okay.
Dr. Price answered that one.
Okay, good.
My next question was concerning mythicism. What do you see as the biggest or the most important conceptual obstacle that people have within your academic field against taking the mythicist hypothesis seriously?
I think it's just the outrageousness of it, that it's unheard of, and so people automatically think, well, there can't be anything to it. I mean, some people just out and out say that. I've been told or heard said about me that, well, no serious scholar believes this. Well, that means nothing. I mean, nobody believed in continental drift theory except the guy that discovered it for a long time. It could be that I'm a nut, but you have to then show that, and nobody has in my experience yet. But I think it's simply the outrageousness of it that it's going to turn everything over and make it impossible to play the same old game of historical Jesus studies, much less the standard Christian view of the incarnate Christ. So I think it's just unthinkable, unfortunately.
Thank you. All right, I have one other question, and given the time of year, I think it's appropriate. I'm curious what you make of people like Bill O'Reilly and Fox News and their talk of the war on Christmas and the war on Christianity. I understand that you think that they're somewhat right to make this criticism of those of us who are agitating for a church-state separation and who sometimes get concerned about, Christmas displays and things like that.
Yes, it's obvious that this. Yeah, it seems to me clear that people seem to think that religion is a contagious disease, and despite the fact that the vast majority of people in the society believe in it, or let's not even say that, just like it, because you have Christmas displays in Japan where everybody's Buddhist or Shinto. Oh no, that's bias, that's theocracy. We can't have that. That would be a violation of church and state. That is one of the most ludicrous things I have ever heard. And O'Reilly is quite right when he says if a store tells the help you can't say Merry Christmas, what the heck? I admit it's important, but it's certainly going on. And
did we lose him again?
I mean, I'm a big
You're
Christmas
good.
fan, but to me it has more to Scrooge. So I think, yeah, there's a war on Christmas, and it seems to me it's folly to deny it, and it's so obviously wrong to deny it. I mean, incorrect, that it makes you wonder if these of the propaganda that of the war against Christmas is ridiculous. Let's see, I can't hear anybody yet.
Yeah, you're okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we heard you. You broke up a bit, but
You're breaking
thank
up
you,
a little bit, but you're
thank you,
right.
Dr. Price.
Uh-huh.
Thanks, Ozzy, for asking those questions. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, man. We got another caller here. Since nobody's calling us on our Blog Talk Radio, we're gonna bring in this fellow here. We're gonna bring in Dark Matter 2525. I don't know if Dr. Robert M. Price knows who Dark Matter 2525 is, but Dark Matter, what question do you have for our guest here, Bob?
Hi, Dr. Price. I was just wondering, how would you go about explaining to a creationist that the Genesis account of creation is not meant to be taken literally?
Well, I think that the priestly creation account of chapter 1 is meant to be taken literally, just as Thales and Anaximander philosophers writing around the same time meant their theories of the origin of the world to be taken literally. Of course, they're not dogmatizing. They were just saying, yeah, here's the way I bet it happened. But we don't know that the Genesis 1 writer meant anything other than that either. In fact, his view of the way the elements were separated and everything emerged from water, it sounds very much like the Ionian philosophers. The Genesis chapter 2 thing, that's really tough to say. It's obviously a set of myths, but probably the ancients believed that it happened that way. But there is simply no way that it did, as Origen knew back in the 2nd century. He said no adult believes a snake spoke to a man. And he said, obviously, this is an allegory. It'd be absurd to take it.
Hello.
You still there? You break up, Bob. Bob in the United
yes,
States.
I am,
There
yes.
you go. Good.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, you broke up a little bit.
We didn't hear part of that answer. I guess
Yeah.
the last
The
minute or
last
so.
a few seconds. Sorry. I mean, like, at least it's not ATV's Bob of Canada. You know, if ATV was here, I would ask him how Bob in Canada's doing.
Hey.
There you go. You're back. There you go.
Oh.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I meant to say that though the Genesis 2 Garden of Eden story is plainly mythological, that doesn't mean that many of the ancients didn't think it was as true as they thought the Gilgamesh epic was true. But there were ancient people that understood it as an allegory, like Origen of Alexandria in the 2nd century. He said, no adult thinks a snake spoke to a man. He says, clearly this is to prod you into seeking some deeper level of meaning.
Do you think that they were just trying to cover their butts by saying that, or that they that it was more like they knew that this didn't jive with reality, so they decided, oh, okay, this must be allegory in order to maintain the Bible's authority and the Bible's.
I'm missing most of what you're saying there.
Yeah, it's internet connection on your end, Bob. Can you hear me now?
Boy.
Good. I'm sorry. Good. Dark matter. Good. See if he can hear
Kind
you.
of.
Do you think that even if the Bible, if the Genesis writers did mean for the story to be taken literally, that the later church leaders kind of took on the idea that it was allegory in order to save the story, in order to kind of cover their butts, so to speak, because they knew it didn't happen that way.
I think Origen is an example of that. All allegorizing, all of the Bible or of the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's what started it. The Stoics were reading their scripture, Homer, and there was a lot of stuff was embarrassing to their more sophisticated view. And so they said, well, we can't deny scripture, but suppose it doesn't mean to say all those silly things on the surface. Maybe these things are more philosophical and they're just written in nursery school language. Well, all allegorizing like that is an attempt to make an embarrassing text look good, no matter who does it. So basically, I think, though, once you come up with that alternative, I'm sure these theologians sincerely believed and said, okay, yeah, we're really getting into the deep stuff here. So in a sense, it's butt covering, but it's to cover up their own embarrassment.
We got Bob the robot here. I want to do the robot dance. You all right? You there? You there? Can we hear you now, Bob? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, yeah, you're breaking up pretty bad here, but yeah. I just want to really. It's 11 o'clock now, and we're going to close the show down here. I just want to put out a huge thank you to Bob, Robert M. Price. Thank you very much for. Guys, in the chat, all you guys that are watching us live now in the chat, there's like 70 people in here. Just thumbs up. Thank you very much for your time. And join us tonight on the show. We had a little technical difficulty, but we figured it out. So we got you on, and it was great recording, and I'll upload it, and I'll give you a copy of it, Bob, tomorrow.
Great.
And yeah, it was great to have you. And guys, please go purchase his new book, Evolving Out of Eden. It came out in March, but please go support our guest tonight, Bob. And if you want more information on Robert M. Price, please head up www.robertmprice.mindvendor.com. That's Robert M. Price .mind, mindvendor.com, mindvendor.com, Robert M. Price mindvendor.com. And that's all I really got to say. Negation, you got anything to say? We'll move to Matthew.
I just wanted to remind everybody that the next few guests we have coming up. Remember, 21st is J.P. Jennings, and the 11th is Sean Faircloth. But again, guys, I just want to tell Bob, Dr. Price, thank you. This was I really enjoyed the discussion, and I really enjoy all your books and what you're doing. So, other than that, have a good week, everybody.
Yeah, he dropped out. And before Matthew goes, guys, don't forget that we're going to be heading over to the after party, after show here, and it's going to be on my personal channel, Live Life 8072. So there's a link right there if you guys want to head over there after this. Matthew, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that he just highlighted the main point of what we're doing here. It's important to focus on what the facts, what the evidence says.
Correct.
And he that seems to be his philosophy as well. He's not so much concerned with deconverting anyone from Christianity, even changing their beliefs, but just making sure that what is factually true, according to reality, is understood. That it's in education and it's in the public sphere, and everyone understands that even if they choose to believe something different than that the facts themselves don't change. And that it makes the especially the Jesus mysticism or mythicism aspect of Christianity, it's really it makes no difference when it comes down to it. And we have to make sure that is our focus going forward with this dialogue with Christians. That it's about, no matter what anyone believes, it's about what's true. That's all I have.